Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director for the Texas Politics Project. Top of the morning, Josh.
Top of the morning to you.
So we are coming to you a day or so early this week, I guess, for scheduling reasons. Today we thought we'd do, a little bit of a drill down into one of the big topics that's preoccupying the Capitol crew in Texas right now. And if you're a national politics person, I hope you don't just tune out right away. But, this probably has some larger implications. But if you're in, the world of the Capitol right now or following Texas politics very closely, and it does require certainly very closely is one of the themes today, what you're looking at is the unfolding speaker's race in the Texas House of Representatives. What we thought we'd do is look at some of the data we have on the Texas speaker and related issues. This could take us a few places. We'll see how far we get, but let's dive down on this. So, we kind of start in terms of thinking about public opinion related to the Speaker of the House, with the nugget of historical conventional wisdom that all things being equal, the more a speaker is a matter of public discussion and is known to the public, the less good it is for his standing and for his politics. And this is an artifact of as I've called conventional wisdom, that goes back to a different era. People I know associate it really generally, and I've mentioned this in the podcast before. I'm speaking out of school with Pete Laney, I think, is the person you're most likely to probably see that attributed to now. If we were to ask former Speaker Laney about that, he might tell us where he got it. It might have been a previous speaker, but we'll set that aside for now. Now, and that the more a speaker is known generally, and I was looking at some of our past data, and we don't have a lot of data on this, but again, roughly speaking, the more the more you become known, it's generally, if you become well known, it's generally not that good for your public opinion standing. Now, you can think about the causality of that a couple of different ways. So, and it's certainly in the case of the current speaker, becoming more well known and becoming a subject of public discussion, has not been good for his numbers to, spoiler alert.
Yeah, it's interesting. Hearing you talk about it, we've talked about, the Laney rule before and this notion about public opinion and the speaker, and I've never really thought about, the mechanics of it so much because it hasn't really been an issue. And obviously now it's becoming more of an issue. But what's interesting about that is it's not even so much that, their statewide numbers become a problem directly. It's indirectly, right? It's because, if the speaker becomes that well known, they become an issue either way. And if you think about it, I'm just thinking out loud now, in a house that, that generally you see, even at the end of the process, usually pretty far, wide bipartisan support for whoever the speaker is, at least in the final voting tallies.
By the process, you mean of selecting the speaker?
Yeah, of selecting the speaker within the House. At least the ones I've seen most often, it's not been like a close vote. It's usually, pretty much everybody selecting somebody. Now, what that sort of speaks to is at a certain point, when the speaker becomes well known, that can become a problematic vote for some people or lots of people, right? As the speaker becomes an object of, whatever, evaluation even.
Right. I think there's still, as we'll see, a question of how broad that is.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because at that point, the question is how much of this is psychology and intra-group dynamics and how much of it is a matter of public politics. And I think the intersection of that in this
it's
is
really
very,
what's interesting and kind of tricky about this.
Yeah.
We talk about the fact that the speaker's race is a race for, one person to be hired by the rest of the House, essentially to distribute power, right?
Yeah.
And that's a big deal, right?
Right.
It's a huge deal. But to
Yeah, which is what makes it such an internal thing, and why figuring out the external facing element of it is very interesting
and tricky, right?
Right.
So let's look at the external facing.
So if we look at the overall trend lines, and a look at the overall trend lines really provides at least some grounding for this kind of discussion, and that the idea that when the speaker became a subject of a new level of sustained, direct, and public criticism during the last session, his job approval ratings dipped and his disapproval climbed. I mean,
right.
All again allowing for a steady share of between about a fifth and a quarter who had no view of him. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, by the time this is up, at the Texas Politics Project website at texaspolitics.utexas.edu, we'll post a lot of the data we're talking about, in particular this trend data, so you can have a look at that. And if you want to, do that and go listen there or look while you're listening, just follow the link to the blog section of the website, and it'll be near this. The podcast with the data will be near the top of that.
Right. So
but the trend line is pretty clear, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we look, where we are right now, just to give us where we were in August, 21% of Texas voters said they approved of the job that Speaker Phelan is doing. 27% disapproved. 52% couldn't provide an opinion either way. They said they neither had an opinion or just didn't know, right?
Yeah.
We look at Republicans, right, and this is really the key, the key groups here for this whole issue, right? 27% held a favorable view, 21% held an unfavorable view. Again, about half no opinion, but net positive. Just to be clear here, it's not as though the speaker has generated a bunch of goodwill among Democrats because the House impeached Phelan. No, again, and we'll get to why nobody cares, but it's 7 Democrats, 17 approve of the job he's doing, 34% disapprove, 49 don't know. Again, a lot of that probably has to do just with knowing the partisanship of the House even. I'm not even sure that's necessarily even – I think that's probably an overstatement of Democratic knowledge of who Phelan is, to be quite
I mean, generally, if you look at our, a lot of these approval numbers, if, particularly people like Phelan and other actors a little, less in the public eye than, say, the governor and the president, even the lieutenant governor. Right. I think there's a good argument. This would actually be a good piece to, to suggest, as you say, that, you ask Democrats about state government 20 plus years into the Republican monopoly of governance and state elected offices and both chambers of the legislature. If you're a Democrat, you've probably developed a reflex that just says, I just don't approve of those guys.
Yeah, exactly. And that's sort of like, not crazy or surprising, And I think, and then, something honestly related to that is we're seeing that increasingly among independents too, right? Because it's not that they like Democrats, but Democrats aren't really the object of their attention most of the time in Texas.
And I think it's, and so it's interesting to look at that trend line figure and see the clear, a clear sign of when things got much tougher for Phelan.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that trend line is pretty clear over the last couple of years. I mean, among Republican voters, his net job approval, the difference between his approval and disapproval, closes remarkably just between April and June of 2023. It goes from among Republicans, it goes from plus 30 to just plus 6. And I remember when we saw that, we wondered if it would stay, if it was, if that was just going to be a glitch and it was going to go back up. And it's wavered a little bit since then, but it's not gone back into, a net positive rating of him of double figures since that June of 2023 poll. Now, that seems not that long ago, but, we've got 8 polls since then, something like that, right? And so, the timing of that drop, obviously, again, between April and June of 2023, coincides with deepening public hostility in the relationship between the speaker and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, in which the hostility of that, and part of this, as we'll get to, is an artifact of the media environment, but that hostility is, very public and very direct in a way that even during the worst days of the Strauss speakership, and by the worst days, I mean, the most conflict between then Speaker Strauss and the Lieutenant Governor Patrick, even in the worst period of that, was not as open. And then, that negativity escalates with the impeachment of Attorney General Paxton in the House, and then what many see as the lieutenant governor's engineering of Paxton's exoneration in the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, amidst all of this, then, putting further pressure on these numbers, Phelan's opponents fund a very serious primary challenge back in his House district, which Phelan barely beats back. Now, we could still say to that, and yet...
Right, and yet he did, right? I mean, ultimately, and that's you know, the other issue here, which is, and yet most people aren't paying attention to this. I mean, as you're going through all that, I'm thinking to myself about the change in these numbers, and one of the questions I can't answer, but I can decompose is like, well, what led to those changes, right? And I don't know the exact distribution of this, but I can decompose it and say some of that is, you know, the most attentive Republicans watching what's going on, looking at the impeachment, looking at the way that Patrick has aligned against Phelan. And maybe prior to that, given, again, multiple, or at least I'll say two specifically, very conservative legislative sessions, right, which produced a ton of conservative legislation. And then you see this drop. So some of that drop is going to be the attentive Republicans. Some of that is going to be actually people who have never heard of Phelan at all, but now this is the first thing they're hearing about him, is that he, you know, fill in the blank, you know, I'm putting this in quotes and italics, you know, orchestrated the impeachment of Paxton, or he, you know, stood in the way of vouchers or whatever. And the thing that, you know, I think we talked about this at various points in time, but I'll point it out again. And, you know, other than Phelan sort of, you know, standing up for himself, there's really no organized allied group to give the opposite message.
Yeah.
You know, at that point, especially during the impeachment, you know, trial, there wasn't a bunch of money being spent to say, actually, these are valid claims, or actually most of the House voted. And so, you know, that's, as we talked about a lot, the information environment in which, you know, again, people who were developing an opinion about Phelan that they maybe didn't have before was going to be really negative. And I think that's something that we kind of see here.
And as we commented at the time, and you know, I think we were commenting about this, as I recall, at least on the podcast, mainly in response to fluctuations in views of the Paxton impeachment, views of Paxton at the time, you know, is because we know, as we say in here all the time, that on issues that voters don't, or issues, or in this case, people, that voters don't have well-developed opinions about, they look to partisan, you know, for cues to their partisan opinion leaders and elected officials. And this was a very conflictive time if you were looking to more well-known Republican elected officials for cues on what you should think about this.
Yeah, and if you think about it, if you're feeling, you're like, I've got Rick Perry.
Yeah,
you
right.
know, which was about honestly the most probably well-known person he could really mobilize to his cause.
And the, you know, as you know, we'll get to a little bit later, but still, or we'll explore a little bit later. Phelan, you know, the governor, you know, who would have been somebody who's weighing in, could have been probably have a decisive influence on people. The governor kind of stayed out of it and you know, at least publicly, and was very, you know, quiet and kind of tried to be above the fray in terms of the Paxton impeachment and the fighting between Phelan and Patrick during the regular session of that year. And, you know, while the governor has been more restrained and strategic, I think, in the ensuing months or ensuing year or so since then, you know, the silence, I think, spoke volumes is one way of saying that. And clearly there were indications behind the scenes in terms of the governor's, you know, relatively unprecedented intervention in House races and over the voucher issue, et cetera. So, but still, given all that, you know, the data that we had about the runoff and about Phelan's challenge in the primary suggests that for all of this, most people were not following this.
Yeah, right. In April of this year, when we asked people how much they'd heard about the runoff election in the district of Representative Dade Phelan, Speaker of the Texas House, and yes, we put all that information in there on purpose so that we could say, you know, whatever you've heard about, you know, whether it's the speaker's race, whether it's about Dade Phelan, whatever it is, we're trying to get that in there. Only 14% of Texas voters said they'd heard a lot about the runoff election, including only 13% of Republicans, 16% of self-identified conservatives, and at the high end, 26% of those who said they're extremely conservative. So that's, you know, the target audience, I think, within primaries, but that speaks to the point here. Significantly less Texans overall. in June 2024, after the results of that, we had, well, how much have you heard about the results of the runoff election in the district of Representative Dade Phelan, Speaker of the Texas House? Again, only 14% said a lot. Again, only 13% of Republicans said a lot. Only 13% of conservatives. Only 20% of extreme conservatives. I like that that went down because it wasn't actually the outcome. I think that, in some ways,
Right.
there's a little motivated reason here about what kind of news you pay attention to, right?
Right. But I mean, what strikes me about that is that, that number among extreme conservatives went down, but also how consistent those two numbers are.
Yeah, very consistent.
Which, is an interesting kind of thumbnail,
Yeah.
for what, these kinds of politics. And on the other side, it's just worth noting that, we're not hiding the ball here or anything. In that April 24 poll, about just the runoff, the existence or that the runoff was taking place, 57% said they'd heard not much or nothing. And a quarter, and very similar numbers in the following, as you would imagine, since the front end numbers were similar. The similar, very similar numbers in June. I think 59% say they haven't heard very much or nothing at all. In both polls, about a quarter say they've heard nothing at all.
This is a great Chat Schneider moment. Maybe we'll come back to it, but I'll wait and see if there's a point for it.
So all this brings us to, one of the points here, I think, that is, absent a clear scandal or other massive external factor that really, just draws attention. It would have to be pretty cataclysmic, I think. A speaker's race does come down, as you were saying, to politics in the chamber. And I think we can argue that some of these external politics have seeped in more, and I'll talk about, kind of some hypotheses on that. But, I think it's fair. I think, and you may or may not, I think Phelan's numbers, such as they are unlikely to have much direct impact either in his favor or against him.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying that nobody's going to mention it or they, they won't be in some ways misrepresented, which I want to get to, which they have, but it's not like anybody's going to stand up and go, look, Dade Phelan's, net approval numbers have really gotten bad since the last session. We need a new speaker. That's not really the argument that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, this is where I was going back to, what I said before about the mechanics of this. And I think, given what we're saying about the internal politics and how this is really about, power dynamics and all kinds of coalitional and intercoalitional politics. But I think, and again, I'm not a member, so I'm not trying to speak, as if I were. But I'm just, thinking to myself, if I were in that position, where would these numbers matter? Where would Phelan's numbers make a difference in my decision? And the question becomes, would supporting or opposing Phelan have an impact on me in my next election? That's really the fundamental question. Does supporting Phelan mean it's going to be harder for me to win a Republican primary the next time around, right? And to the extent that Phelan remains, below the radar, for the most part, it's less of a factor. Now, the issue is that, there's this intensity question, right? Which is say, well, yeah, it's not that, information about this is, randomly distributed across the electorate. It's probably the case that the messages that are negative about Phelan, and I think we probably see this here, they're most prevalent amongst the most sort of conservative, most engaged kind of voters who are really paying attention to this kind of stuff. Those are also the people that we think tend to have an influence in the primaries, right? So it's not necessarily and I think, maybe this is a way in which, the Laney rule would be updated and there might be some caveats as we move ahead, given all the things, we're talking about changing the environment. But it almost seems like it's not so much about, more than half of the public knowing it's kind of a thumbnail rule, maybe it's kind of a sketch idea. Once you get past there, and part of that, if anything, is because it implies something else, which is if more than the general public, the registered voter pool, has an opinion about you as speaker, it's very likely that the most engaged partisans on both sides have an opinion about you.
Yeah.
And that's maybe where the problem starts to come in. When Phelan's leadership itself becomes an issue for another member, then the politics of it go outside of what we think of as really inside baseball, inside the building, distribution of power, of agenda control. All of a sudden, then it goes to this other thing, and that's where I think it's difficult as a speaker to maneuver.
Yeah, I totally agree that the calculation of self-interest on members and at the top of that or close to the top of that is, how much trouble is this going to cause me, in my next election? And under the circumstances, it is going to be mostly a matter of primary politics.
And usually the answer is no, right? I mean, just if you take a normal, if we just say hey, it's an open speaker's race, It could be any one of these guys that literally nobody in Texas besides some people in their district have any idea who they are, like thoughts about them. Well, then it can totally, I mean, again, the alternative here is useful. Then it can totally come down to the internal politics. What are you offering me? What is this going to do for me and my voters, my constituents, the party, maybe secondarily.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in here that really helps Phelan per se. There's nothing he can use for leverage. He can't say the public has rallied around him.
No.
The best he can do is to say, look, this looks like more or less business as usual in terms of what polling, this was the discussion to be had, looks like around the speaker. But what's going on here isn't about me. It's about, disgruntled outs jockeying for power, an authoritarian lieutenant governor, the ambitions of others.
Right.
There's a lot of other things that are going to take pride of place other than him trying to claim any kind of, mandate or not. Now, his opponents, as I was alluding to a minute ago, can say, and they have said frequently on social media and in their messaging that, he doesn't have high levels of support from his own partisans. Now, this is a little dishonest in the sense that speakers never do.
Right, exactly.
Given the kind of numbers we're talking about. But, even given that, there's really not a lot here for his opponents to draw on, at least not if they're going to be, reasonably intellectually honest or even just straightforwardly honest about it.
Yeah, which I would say in this case, matters more, probably matters more than it does in normal public politics, right, in some ways, because this is an argument that's being made to the voters about, this is an argument being made to other members.
Yeah.
Right? You're saying, no, his public persona is a problem for you. Well, ultimately, you have to convince that member that that's true. And that's actually a pretty heavy lift, I think, in this case.
I think so, too. I mean, although, again, I don't know if you mentioned it before the podcast or now, there's a, motivated reasoning will do a lot of lifting in this.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, look.
on everybody's part,
we don't need to,
in the scenario you're talking about.
Yeah, well, and look, and I don't want to, we don't need to get into the details, or I don't know if we're going to get into these kind of details, but that statement is true until it's not, which is a great way to cover myself. But by which I mean, it's easy. It's a heavy lift to say that, public attitudes towards the speaker are going to affect you personally as a member. Having said that, we'll kind of talk about this maybe, to the extent that, there's ideas out there that all of the Democrats might align with some of the Republicans for, either a Phelan, another Phelan speakership or even somebody else. I think that's where this would get tested, because at that point, all of a sudden, if you're one of these minority of Republicans who go along with the Democrats, I'm not saying it's going to happen. I don't think this is, but let's say they did. All of a sudden, your support of the speaker, regardless of what people thought about it, does become an issue in your next election because you aligned with the Democrats. But that's actually the point again. It's not necessarily because, you aligned with a rhino speaker or whatever, anything like that people are going to say. It's because, no, you voted with all the Democrats. That's actually what's going to be the thing that becomes the issue here. So even that kind of actually furthers this idea that it's not really the speaker's persona itself so much as if the support of whoever this person is becomes an issue. Because honestly, to my mind, if the ultimate ending candidates become, a choice between Representative Cook, let's say, and somebody not named Phelan who's also a Republican, I don't think the outcome of that vote is going to make any difference in any Republican's primary elections, unless one of those members is overtly anti-vouchers or overtly anti-Ken or something that would just already disqualify them some way of being in that position to begin with.
Yeah,
I think
I'm
a lot of stuff
trying
there.
to follow all the
Sorry.
elements of that scenario,
yeah,
but sure.
Yeah,
I think.
Thank you.
But I think it's. So what do we make of this? So you've kind of broached the race now. No, it's good. I wanted to go there. This does sort of, speak to a few current events. Or more recent developments in this. The meeting last week at the county line in which, a group of, it's a little unclear, what the nature of the representation here was. Some staff members were there representing their elected officials. Some of the elected officials were there, but some of the elected officials to be were at this meeting. I've seen different numbers. The count varied.
Yeah.
Initially, it was going to be 25.
That's the number in my mind.
Later on, somebody was saying that there were as many as, depending on how you count it, as many as 50.
So huge crowd size.
In the realm of 50 votes, and I again,
yeah,
I'm sure we could get email on this about how, we know what the facts are, but I'm not sure we do.
Well, I would say is we don't know, and there's a lot of reason for people involved to say the numbers were larger than they were.
Yeah,
so
right.
that's all. So I said I heard the same numbers you originally 25, but that was before the meeting happened. What happened?
Yeah, I think after when the meeting
was
was happening, people were saying that there were more than 25, but again, like what counted as representation, I think is still a little bit vague in my mind.
Right.
And happy to hear more about this from listeners. But, to the extent that his opponents have succeeded in clearing the field, coalescing a group of Phelan opponents around Representative David Cook, who you mentioned earlier, nominally it does seem like Phelan's position appears weakened. I mean, you were kind of talking about this a little bit before the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, if you look at, and I know there's people can have various arguments about this, but if you look at sort of the ideological distribution of House members, right, and it's useful. I mean, ultimately, I want to just say at the outset there are no moderate, House Republicans. I mean, everybody. This is all relative flavors of conservatism. So I'm not calling anybody a moderate here in this left-right continuum. I'm not saying anybody's a liberal. Just wanted forestall any emails. But if you look actually, you look at the candidates who coalesced around Cook, and you look at where Cook is really right in the middle of the ideological distribution of the Republican caucus, at least per public votes. And if you look at the candidates, the prior candidates who supported him, they actually came from pretty far across the ideological spectrum, with Shelby Slauson sort of furthest to the right, James Frank furthest to the left. Again, all on the right. We're all on the right here, right?
Furthest to the less right.
Yeah, further to the less right. So one, that's at least on its face is kind of plausible. To the extent you think like, someone like Slauson or Oliverson, the idea that like, they are coming with them holding some number of votes. Otherwise, they wouldn't necessarily have put their name in the ring to begin with if they didn't have some support that they could potentially at least, carry with them or move. We'll see.
Yeah.
But if that's the idea, then again, this is also, we don't know. But the idea is then there are some votes coming from different parts of the GOP coalition. And then what we also know is based on the primaries, if you look at that same distribution of representatives, a lot of the members who were removed via the primary process or who retired because of, threats or other reasons came from the left-hand side of that spectrum. So all of this is to say, if you're saying, where was Speaker Phelan before, and we've talked about this, Mike said, before this week, you'd say, hey, he's still probably, the highest likelihood person of being Speaker again. That doesn't mean 90%. It just means the highest likelihood probability. Has that probability gone down, probably, significantly for me in the last, week or two? Yeah, I would say so. Now, it doesn't mean it's down to zero or he's not, a significant possibility in here, but it's looking a little bit more challenging to find his way back.
I was tempted to ask you what the number was if it's not zero, if it's more than 50%, or less than 50%.
No, it was never more than 50%. I mean, my thinking is that, part of it is, you looked at the people who were already out there, and I'm not saying they had high probabilities, but they take some probability. And then you got to figure there's some share of the probability that goes to the unnamed person who's ultimately likely to be the actual next speaker, who we just don't know who that is, right? And that's probably one of the highest probability outcomes. But if we talk about the named people, my thinking was Phelan was probably somewhere in the 20 to 30% probability range, like again, the plurality choice, and then I think now, I think that's more like, 15, 20% maybe. I mean, maybe a little less.
I think he's still in better position than that myself, just because unless, somehow we find out that David Cook turns out to be a better alternative to Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah, I just don't know how the caucus rules are going to play out on this, right? So, I mean, my understanding, just, for people who pay attention here, is that, essentially the GOP caucus has passed a rule that says that, essentially you're going to need a supermajority support in the caucus to basically be the speaker candidate. If somebody gets supermajority in the caucus, the idea is that, even if you oppose that person as Republican, you're supposed to support them in the public vote.
Yeah, supposed to.
And again, but honestly, but this is how, I mean, I guess I game this out. Part of this is to say, yes, supposed to, and I agree. But like, if you're sitting there as part of the 2/5, let's say, of Republicans who aren't necessarily behind or haven't just agreed to, a consensus candidate, the one thing you guarantee if you join up with the Democrats to support Phelan or anybody else is you're going to get primary challenged next time. And I think that was a very, very costly proposition this time around that is going to be on members' minds. And, I think we've had some recent examples. We don't have to go into the podcast, but there are a lot of recent examples where there are some Republicans who have reticence about going along with the group, but then faced with the reality that the group is going that way, don't want the trouble, right? And I sort of think that if close to that number within the caucus can agree on somebody, which is a big if, I think that becomes a real challenge. I just don't see how that person is feeling right now, especially on this main thing, which is the Democratic committee chair issue. Phelan could switch on that and say, no, I'm not going to give any Democratic committee chairs either. And that would be a big switch and would be, I think, useful to him at this point. But as of right now, if this is about the distribution of power and worrying about your next primary, whether or not you're going to get primary challenge next time, you have one person who, if you vote for him, you're not going to get primary challenge because you didn't support Phelan, first of all. And this person is already saying, I've got more committee chairs to give out. So what's the pitch on the other side?
Yeah, no, well, I think there is a pitch, and the pitch is, you can turn some of those people.
Yeah, no, I'm asking. I'm curious.
You can turn some of those people once it becomes inevitable. I mean, if you look at kind of the internal qualitative history of these House races, there's always this moment that we're in right now where people are kind of making the self-interested calculations you're doing and, whatever else, particular members drop into that, their feelings about the Senate, their feelings about Lieutenant Governor Patrick in this case.
That's a tricky extra factor.
Right,
here.
Which I think is, again, we talked about it, a hard factor to weigh.
It is very hard to weigh.
Because it's not, it's not as concrete and readily recognizable as one's anxiety about a primary challenge.
Yeah,
but it's there in a kind of, inchoate sort of way, but it's there.
And there's not a straight line, obviously, between those attitudes and what it manifests even.
Part of the factor here, I think, is going to be how bad does Dade Phelan want to be Speaker? Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, how much will the Democratic caucus hang together in his favor? Now, we don't know the answer to either of those. But, historically, and this was in the key caveat here is that this was in a much less ideologically sorted and polarized political system. But historically, it is, at the end of the day, a race to 76 to get in the chair. And then you get in the chair and you sort those other problems out once you're in the chair. And I don't disagree with you that, it's a disruptive fight in the caucus and at the primary level if Phelan says, I want to be Speaker no matter what. Yeah. He, arrives at some marketable position with the Democrats on Democratic chairs that also, and we talked about this quite a while ago, that uses the fungibility of that situation to soften some of the opposition in conjunction with offering the kinds of things you mentioned, like more committee chairs. So, for example, if you said, look, you go to the Democrats and say, I'm not going to, and again, I don't know if this is going on or not, but, I am not going to commit to no Democratic committee chairs, but I am going to commit to a reduction in this and to phasing this model out under my remaining speakership, which means there will be fewer Democratic committee chairs next time. And your option is fewer or none.
Right.
Right. And how many Democrats can you bring along with that and reduce the number of votes you need from your own caucus? But in doing that, you also increase the number of chairs you have to distribute. And it's that fungibility, but that I think is the key factor here in terms of thinking about, and what's happened in the past is when you get to 76, and this goes to your point about how these races are often consensual. Once it looks like somebody's going to win, people want to jump on board. I mean, there are, tales in some of the video that we've got to go back a ways, the speaker race in which Billy Clayton succeeded Price Daniel Jr. in the early to mid 70s, 74, I guess, in which, there are tales of literally, they're having the caucus meetings in the Driscoll, and the word is circulating that they're at 76, and people are, running towards the elevator where where Clayton's team was going, wait, we want to be on board.
Right.
And people and the doors are closing and they're going kind of, well, too late.
Yeah.
But that's why I say it really does kind of hinge on, how badly does Phelan really want this? And I think, look, all the signs that we're seeing now, particularly, him bringing in people like Mike Toomey and Rick Perry, is that, they're going to the mats. All right, they're going to the mattresses, to use the Godfather term, right? I mean, they are going to, they want to retain the speakership, and they are going to do this, whatever the longer game is. And you may still be right that the longer game may be bad. I mean, I think you are right. That longer game could wind up being bad for some of these members unless the session happens, they get together, they win the speakership. The Democrats are kind of locked into it, and, Phelan mends some fences in some ways.
Yeah, this is really,
Now, that may or may not be possible at this point, but, there are ways to maybe try to alleviate some of that pressure going forward. And if you really game this out, some of this is going to depend on what the political environment looks like in the 2026 election, and that, in fact, is going to be strongly influenced by who wins the presidential race. So we've gone from like the most interior of Texas, institutional politics to the big picture, the big context of that election does matter a lot.
Yeah, it's all really interesting. I think the thing that, you've convinced me of here is, the importance of Phelan's commitment to the speakership, and winning. That really is a fun, if you think about it, there's so much that is sort of unknowable and behind the scenes and all that stuff. But if you think about one factor that really does tell you, like, whether and if so, how messy this could turn, it's Phelan's willingness to basically engage the Democrats in a deal and see who we can get to come along. And then the question becomes, there's two sort of things that fall out of that for me.
Yeah.
One is, to your point, and I think this speaks to some changes in the environment questions,
Yeah.
So one is, so you get to 76 and the writing's on the wall, and then the question becomes, how many of the other Republicans fall in with that and then say, I don't want to be on the outside looking in, to your point. I don't want to be outside the elevator at this point. There's still a bunch of committees to go around past 7, given how many Democrats there are and how many Republicans you need, there's still a bunch of other committees to chair, a bunch of work to be done.
The speaker can do a lot of things for people.
Yeah. And so the question becomes, one,
for his voters.
Yeah. One, how quickly are sort of the non-Phelan Republicans, scared off? That's sort of one question to me, or scared into line. And that's an interesting thought.
Scared or incentivized.
Yeah.
Fear is a type of incentive, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
Positive and negative incentives.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah, that's right. And to make this clear, like, it doesn't matter. They're both there. The mix is there. For individual at a point in time, it'll be what it's going to be. So that's interesting. The other thing I think is interesting about that whole dynamic is, I wonder what Phelan's standing with the Democrats does look like here. And again, we're not talking about statewide polling. We're talking about within the caucus. If you think about it, yes, there is a sort of, the enemy of my enemies is my friend kind of mentality here that could win the day. And obviously Phelan would be, significantly better deal to Democrats than almost anybody else who's going to win the gavel, based on the dynamics we're talking about here, unless there's something totally different, right? But at the same time, I can't help but think, this is the speaker who did deliver two of the most conservative, Texas legislative sessions in history, as many people will sort of attest to. This is a speaker who did, kind of famously say with his purple glasses, I'm done bashing on, the gays and the lesbians and all that stuff. And then kind of oversaw a pretty continuous bashing on LGBTQ people. And so, I don't think it's one of those things where one of the things that probably benefits Phelan is what we were talking about here, which is that, his low profile among Democratic voters and the fact that he's not going to be an issue for Democratic House members, in terms of who they voted for in the speaker's race. That's not going to be something that's going to come up in their primary election next time. So, I don't see that as necessarily a thing, but I do wonder to what extent, when he says, hey, I've got a deal for you, how well that's received among, sort of Democratic decision makers.
Other
than to say it's better than anything else you're going to get,
and that's going to depend on the deal,
yes.
Right? And that's going to, entail some bargaining. So,
well, I was going to say, just as a transition to some other points you just want to close out with, but this is harder now, right? I think part of what's interesting is, like, this is all, in some ways, we can talk about this in these old saws, and I think about, kind of the people that I, started learning about Texas politics from, and a lot of them seem to be retiring, and this idea that this is so internal and opaque and all this kind of stuff. And yet at the same time, like, at least in my experience, I mean, this is one of the most sort of public, in a lot of ways, races, at least I've seen, recently. And I don't mean, again, this is all still taking place behind the scene, but the amount of attention paid to it. So it does seem like some fundamental changes in the environment have taken place.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to, I think that's a good transition to close it out. I mean, I was just going to say, there's a few things. I mean, having, regaled with a story about the 70s, I don't want to seem too locked into that, and mention, having mentioned Billy Clayton and Pete Laney in the same podcast about speakerships, I mean, all of this does point to like, interesting questions about, and I think the outcome of this is going to be very material to this, about the degree to which the context and the structural institutional factors around, the selection of the speaker has changed. And, a few of those clearly, and we've kind of had occasion that this is already kind of, we bumped up against this in the discussion, media changes. Look, in the longer term, the media environment, I mean, to use the race I was talking about before, the Billy Clayton, the speaker race that produced Billy Clayton as speaker, the media environment, very different, and I think, we leap right, to social media now, and I think that's fair. I mean, much of this fight has taken place over social media, and a lot of the heat came from social media, and that's been going on for a little while. I mean, the most vicious fighting over the last three speakers, Strauss, Bonin, now Phelan, really metastasized and was fed over social media, particularly Twitter. And, that seeps into the coverage. And then the other, piece of this, which is kind of the intermediate piece, which I think gets missed. I mean, the social media thing everybody's talking about now, but I think the intermediate piece, and we were talking about this beforehand, and I kind of, this kind of occurred to me as I was working on lectures for the intro class a few years ago. And in the longer term, I think you have the rise of a kind of more specialized political media is really important to understanding this. In the longer term, I mean, we're seeing this at the national level too. I mean, ground zero for this is like, the creation of Politico, right? But then in Texas, we've seen our own. There were always things like, Ross Ramsey's Texas Weekly, Harvey Kronberg's Quorum Report, these very focused, that began really essentially as newsletters, has really, metastasized, and not metastasized is the wrong word, has really evolved. I mean, and it's spread. I mean, there's just more attention to inside baseball. You've got the Texas Tribune, and, particularly when the Tribune started, I think honestly they're not as attentive to this stuff as they used to be, or not as focused on it. It's up to them mission-wise, but a lot of attention to inside baseball in very specialized media outlets. You've got the Texas Tribune, you've got the Texan, now you've got the new left sort of thing, crooked, not crooked. It'll come to me in a second. And I apologize to the people running that now I can't remember what it's called. It's just, I don't have it in my notes. We'll put a link to you guys in the in the podcast post. All of that just fed attention to things that are very internal, into the internal baseball. And like the social media, it's not that, everybody is now reading those things, but political reporters at the more general outlets are reading that stuff. And they see them as their competition, and it's fed competition for those stories, and the attention to that breaks stories that seep into mainstream media.
Yeah, I was going to say, it informs their coverage. I mean, it is remarkable to think that, the Republicans organizing, or trying to consolidate, against Phelan. It's like, we knew where and when the meeting was before it happened, and then there were people there. I mean, it was just sort of, I mean, it was like, it's just I mean, not to say it's an open secret, because it's not a secret. I mean, it's just sort of, this information is like readily available. And to your point, it may not be covered by the major dailies per se, but all those reporters, they know this is going on.
Well, what happens is that it gets, when it's just at the rumor stage or the speculative stage, it gets covered in the niche outlets and on social media. But that triggers coverage. Once it blooms, if you will, it becomes a more conventional confirmed story, it gets picked up in the mainstream outlets. And then of course there's, the factor that we bring into everything, but because it matters, when you've got more ideologically sorted parties in a state with, that's had a one-party governance pattern for the last 20 years, the conflicts within the Republican Party, like this one, just makes the politics around the speakership more pronounced. Like as you were, parsing out, like, well, there's this faction of Republicans, and how many is that? And, and we look at that stuff all the time. I mean, that just gets more pronounced. And again, to go back, that's not unlike that is not unlike what we saw during the period of Democratic dominance. Yeah. But there was more ideological breadth in the Democratic Party of the 60s and 70s than there is in the Republican Party post-2000.
Right, but it doesn't mean that the fights over agenda control are any less vicious or...
If anything, maybe more.
Yeah, that's right. They're even more consequential in some ways, right?
People are looking for, are looking more broad, more thoroughly for ways of distinguishing themselves on an ideological basis.
For scraps, really.
Yeah, and making this, the argument that we're seeing, which is, who is the true conservative?
Right.
Right, and that was not the kind of campaign theme that you saw in those speakers' fights inside the Democratic Party in the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Even into the 80s to some degree. I mean, it was there, and the upshot was that what you usually got, speaking of Billy Clayton and Pete Laney, was a more moderate to conservative rural Democratic member.
Yeah,
this dynamic is a little more, the word that came to mind, I'm just going to use it, but it's a little more ideologically inbred. To your point, I mean, making the distinction between...
I like that analogy.
Would anybody look at, if you set aside the personalities involved and Dan Patrick and Dade Phelan, whatever, and you look, I mean, we see this from the outside when we see national media looking in. Would anybody really look at what's been going on in the Texas legislature, from a broad ideological perspective, or even a snug in the Overton window? Would you go, man, they're not really very conservative there in Texas, are they?
It's funny.
What's going on? That must be Dade Phelan's fault.
I mean,
ridiculous.
One of the most frustrating calls I got, in the lead up to the primary was from a national outlet where the reporter said, so my understanding is that Abbott is funding a lot of primary challengers against Republicans in his own party because they're moderates. And I was like, well, buddy, let me just say
Let's go back.
I was like, I think that's what he would like you to believe, yes. But but that goes to the point is like there are no moderates. Like, John Campbell, not a moderate. Like, let's just, take a step back and just say none of these people.
And look, to be fair, there are, there are gradations here.
Yeah, and they're different in their different dimensions of, ideology, right?
But adopting the language of one faction or another doesn't really.
And the point here is moderate is meant to be pejorative, right?
That's exactly right.
That's the point. So let's
that is a good point.
It doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not, it's intended as a pejorative in this case.
And then lest we hear from, some of our other listeners, we should also add to this, obviously, the ability to inject money and via this money visibility into a speaker's fight as a result of first speaker candidates having to register with the Secretary of State, which is a relatively new adaptation, from, this century. And the fact that it's been, verified or, legally sort of confirmed that you can spend money on running for speaker as long as you follow some rules, has also changed the dynamics of these races. This kind of goes back to something like, I was going to slightly disagree with you earlier and just, I'll flag it now, which is the, the idea that, going into like the meeting on Friday, everybody came in with some votes. Well, Maybe.
Yeah.
Right. Because there's a lot of, there's an additional incentive now to simply become a candidate to burnish your own political profile and to make you, and to position yourself for something else that might not be speaker.
Yeah.
The Senate seat we're not going to single anybody out, like the Senate seat in your district.
Right.
And let us also, remember that by all indications, with the magnitude of this on each side being shaped by the outcome of the presidential election, the 2026 primaries here at the statewide level are going to have a lot of participants. Or certainly at this point, there are a lot of people thinking about moving on up.
Right. I think that's exactly right. And I think politics is one of these, the most unusual places where, ultimately any reason to actually ask your donors for money is a good reason, right? If you're in the conversation, if you have a reason to, again, ask your donors, go meet new donors, go talk to, expand your political network because you're looking to maybe move beyond what's maybe a district level role to a statewide role, whether that's in the speaker's race or something beyond, is really, it's an opportunity. And so I think that's right here, which is to some extent, that also speaks to some extent why not everybody who jumps in a speaker's race is serious about being speaker.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Yeah. So with that, that's a lot of data and, a little bit of a theory of the case even. Thanks to Josh for joining and all the prep on this. As always, thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, who during the recording of this podcast demonstrated a remarkable ability to handle a crisis and stay on their feet. Again, we talked about a lot of data in this podcast. If you haven't already gone there, try texaspolitics.utexas.edu. We'll have this podcast embedded in a post in our blog section that will have a lot of the illuminative data we used on this, particularly this trend data on the speaker stuff, which is, I think, very interesting, even if you're not that into data. So most of all, thanks to you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.